Sleep did not come easy once more, and Robert fancied that during the night he had heard footsteps nearby, but attributed these to the simple nocturnal wanderings of a lonely deer or stag. While the following day remained overcast and gray, the wind and rain were gone, both a distant memory, but for the occasional accumulation of water on the dirt track. Robert moved onwards, negotiating a network of paths, while realizing that he had strayed from his intended route at some juncture. He was confident, however, that he knew where he was, and that this change would simply be a small detour, and nothing more. At times, he made great progress, when the ground was even enough, stopping occasionally to take in a variety of deep-set valleys and rising peaks. Uncharacteristically, however, he kept his distance as much as he could from the woods and forests which often accompanied the road. While dismissing it as merely his imagination, at times he felt like there was something within them, peering out from the dark, watching. It was late afternoon, and Robert was beginning to feel tired, most probably due to a restless night, combined with the unrelenting pace he had set himself for the day. In the back of his mind, he was still somehow running from something. The path he had been on for the past couple hours had been rather predictable for the most part, but now it curved sharply around a grassy hill to reveal a change in the landscape which had been previously hidden from view. A long stretch of dirt and uneven track penetrated a thick forest of fir trees. What Robert found interesting about the path was that it was unnaturally straight, and what he found oddly frightening about it was that it was so narrow, only a couple feet across. Spreading your arms, you could touch both sides of the forest. The proximity provoked the deepest feelings of overexposure and claustrophobia. If he had been a soldier in a war zone, Robert would have highlighted this long, narrow path as a perfect place for an ambush. Standing with his mountain bike only a few feet away from the beginning of both forest and track, he felt uneasy about the current situation. It was clear that the path was the only way forward, and while it appeared as though it exited the forest a few miles onward, there was something inherently dubious about it. What? Robert could not tell, but he did feel that he did not wish to traverse it. Weighing up the pros and cons, he realized that both the way he came in and the unknown land ahead provoked trepidation in him. For that reason, he dismissed the sense of dread as a figment of his overactive imagination, and with measured movement, slowly set off down the long, straight track, hoping to quickly pass in and out of the forest without incident. A black cloud hovered above, and as Robert negotiated the overly uneven path as quickly as he could, the feeling of foreboding which he had so nonchalantly dismissed began to ferment in his stomach, rising up through his body, forcing the hairs on his arms to stand on end. He kept his head down for the most part, occasionally glancing ahead at what he assumed was his exit in the distance. He just wanted to be through and out of that place as quickly as possible. Just over halfway down the path, and an unnerving, yet unwelcome familiarity overtook him. A sensation which had accompanied him for days, but now seemed to be sharper, grating more profoundly on his nerves, filled Robert's every thought. The feeling of being watched. Stopping for a moment to catch his breath, he tried as best he could to shake the unmovable sensation that he was not alone. The path stretched out ahead, and as is common amongst those who attempt to reach a goal or threshold, without thinking, he looked back to measure his own progress. He had managed to cover a substantial amount of the track's length, and was quite confident that in a short time he would escape that narrow stretch of dirt. But just as he turned to continue onwards, something caught Robert's eye further down the path in front of him. He immediately wished he had not taken the route he had chosen, that he had turned back and started homeward. It was there, unmistakable, unwavering, and utterly paralyzing. Some distance away in the direction he was heading stood a figure. Robert could not entirely define or make out the discrete features of the person, because they were standing to the side of the path, between a cluster of trees, covered in shadow, but this was certainly not his imagination. Someone was standing there, watching, and while Robert was a distance away, it felt to him as though the figure's presence was almost on top of him, its stare accompanied by an uncommonly potent sense of, well, malice was the best way Robert could describe it to himself. Then it was gone, disappearing back into the forest, but the feeling of danger, of necessity to flee, did not diminish or decline, but grew in intensity. The sound of something moving between the trees rang out across the emptiness, increasing in volume as it neared. Robert panicked, turned, and cycled as quickly as he could in a direction he had come. So eager was he to escape that narrow passage, flanked on all sides by the impenetrable forest, that he did not see a deep hole in the ground. The front wheel of his bike crashed into the depression, sending Robert flying over his handlebars, scraping along the ground. Dazed for a moment, the shambling sound of broken branches and displaced leaves, which was nearly upon him, quickly brought Robert's mind into focus. Blood dripped from a wound on his leg, and his arm was badly bruised from the impact. But all he cared about was escaping from that suffocating pathway, away from whoever seemed to be moving in the woods. Robert's beloved paint job across the etched letters, Rob, on the bike's frame, had been scratched slightly in the crash, but that did not concern him. 2 spokes on the bike's front tire were broken, and that most certainly did. The last thing Robert needed was to be completely stranded there, so he would have to ride carefully, and hope that the wheel would not buckle, lasting long enough to carry him home. Home. That was exactly where he intended to go, as quickly as possible, and he was now facing in the direction he had been traveling for days. There was no time like the present. The moving sound in the forest continued, and as Robert carefully, yet at pace, negotiated the broken ground, he hoped above all else that his trusted mountain bike would get him out of there. Despite his obvious advantage of speed, the sound seemed to be only moments behind, and as he came closer to the end of the forest and out into the open, he heard a noise which chilled him to his very core. From within the forest spewed that same, shrieking, tortured cry from the nights before, echoing out, piercing Robert's ears, and scratching through his nerves like a shredder. Was it that figure who had been wandering near Robert's camp at night? Surely no human could make such a sound. Panicking, he increased his speed as the front tire of his bike wobbled and creaked under the pressure and strain. Finally, he was out of that narrow place, but Robert did not stop, cycling for hours without once looking back. Only when sure that his pursuer could not have followed him did he stop to rest. Night was once again drawing in, and now, every sound, every smell, every part of what had always made the countryside fascinatingly inviting to him, took on a new, ominous, and menacing form. He decided that tonight he would not set up a camp. No fire, no tent. Robert was sure that the person following him had been able to do so because of the noise and light which he had made from night to night. It would not be pleasant. It would be cold, wet, and uncomfortable. But Robert wanted to make sure that he could not be tracked. There were various paths and dirt tracks in the area that he could have taken, but hopefully this man who was stalking him, for whatever reason he was doing it, would not be able to find him. Robert knew, of course, that his tire tracks could easily betray his location, if his pursuer was smart enough to follow them. The bike marks were obvious. For this reason, Robert backtracked slightly off the path, in an attempt to confuse anyone following, should the need arise. The worst thing he could do would be to sleep next to where his tracks ended. Finding a large bush with space underneath it to sleep, which was satisfactorily far enough from where his tread marks ended, Robert hid himself and his bike for the night, with one question on his mind. If his stalker was able to keep up with his progress each day, he must have been using a bike or a vehicle of some description. But where were the tire tracks? Sleep did not come at all that night, but around 3 in the morning, that wailing, inhuman noise did, moving around the area, searching. By now, Robert was beginning to suffer from lack of sleep and rest, but in spite of this, at the first sign of daylight, he quickly uncovered his bike from its hiding place and started on his way again. Not one foul noise was heard during that day, nor any evidence that his stalker was anywhere nearby. Rationality began to overtake Robert's fear as night once again settled in. He covered much ground throughout the day, and managed to take care as best he could of his bike's front wheel, which, bar the occasional creak or groan, was performing admirably. Robert concluded, after much soul-searching, that he had allowed himself to get carried away by the isolation of his surroundings, and the, admittedly, unnerving person he had seen in the forest over the past few days. But surely it was preposterous to believe that he was really being followed. Perhaps the individual he had seen was not the same from the strange island of trees. It would make more sense that it was just in fact another camper. Maybe there was a few of them, and that explained the noises. And as for the unfamiliar animal screeching at night, it must just be a species of bird in the area which he had never heard before. That night, Robert would set a campfire. He would cook his food, eat well, and enjoy the solitary countryside as he had intended to for such a long time since planning this holiday. After locating a suitable spot in the forest, this is exactly what he did. He cooked on a roaring campfire and sat for hours gazing at the night sky through the branches of the trees above. There were no noises, no strange shrieks, no shambling footsteps in the darkness, nothing. Confident that his unwelcome traveling companion had been left far behind, Robert retired to his tent exhausted, and in much need of a well-earned rest. 2 paltry hours of sleep later, however, Robert woke to the sound of something stirring outside of his tent. He had left the campfire burning as he was uncomfortable in spending another night in darkness, and its flames seemed to dance, shifting, and changing shape in the night air, casting shadows all around onto the thin canvas of Robert's tent like a naturally occurring cinema screen. Casting one shadow in particular, the shadow of someone sitting by the fire. Robert froze, his mouth went dry, and his breathing became shallow and anxious. He could not believe that he had been so stupid to persuade himself that no one was following him. In lighting another fire, he had led them directly to where he slept, and now they had the upper hand. God knew what they wanted. After a moment of utter terror, Robert realized that he needed to defend himself. Sitting up slowly, and pulling his sleeping bag off and out from under him as quietly as possible, he scanned the tent, looking for something he could cannibalize as a weapon, but anything of weight was in his backpack. A metallic torch, the wood he had taken 10 days earlier, a glass bottle, etc. And he had stupidly left that outside of the tent. He cursed himself for being so reckless, and could scarcely believe that he had left his bag outside when he always kept it inside, away from rain and wild animals. Exhaustion was the only explanation, but that did not keep his current circumstances at all. Then he remembered the old axe head, the black rock he had found in the stranger's camp. Indeed, if it was an axe hand as he had suspected, Robert reckoned it could deal a nasty, perhaps even fatal blow. Running his fingers along its sharp ridges, Robert composed himself, never for a second taking his eyes from the shadow projected by the fire onto the tent wall. The door to the tent was luckily unzipped, but the 2 flaps from the outer fly sheet were draped over the entrance, obscuring his view. With one eye, he peeked through the slit between the 2 flaps of canvas, slowly. There it was, someone sitting at the campfire. By his build, Robert was certain it was a man. The backlight of the campfire made it difficult to decipher any of his features, but the shoulders were broad, strong, and it was clear that the man had been in the wilderness for some time, as it appeared that he was wearing rags of cloth, which hung loosely around him. His head was covered in long strands of black, wet hair, which had clumped together in places, presumably because it had not been washed for some time. Staring at the back of the man's head, Robert tried as best he could to subdue his fear. He thought that he could conceivably sneak up behind him and knock him out with a blow to the back of the head with the black stone. But that could be murder, and Robert didn't even know if the man was violent. Perhaps he was a nomadic type, a gypsy, a traveler. Yes, maybe it was best to wait. Maybe he would just wander off into the woods, although that seemed unlikely. Just as Robert affirmed to himself that if the man made a move towards the tent, he would rush into the open and fight him head-on, he noticed something. Something was odd about the way the man was sitting. First of all, he was sitting still. So still, you would be forgiven for mistaking him for a statue. Not the slightest movement was made, nor was there any indication of life at all. No subtle shifting of weight, no rising and falling of breath. Nothing. While this stillness was unnerving, it was Robert's second observation which bothered him the most. The man was sitting forward, facing the fire, but the shape and position of his upper body and head was somehow off. They did not seem to quite add up. His frame seemed unnaturally positioned. A crackle from the fire, followed by a wayward flicker of light, revealed the truth. The flames lit up the area momentarily. The light bounced from tree to tree, even onto Robert's tent, and reflected back onto what surrounded it. 2 pinpoints of light momentarily shone in the night through black clumps of matted hair. Yes, the man's legs were facing the fire, but his body and head were horribly contorted, twisted into an inhuman posture. The man's legs were indeed facing the fire, but his head and body were facing Robert. This was no man at all. How long had it sat there, staring at Robert in that tent, waiting? He did not know, but a creak of movement from its neck was enough to send Robert out of the tent, into the woods, consumed by a terror so profound that it could be likened to madness. He did not know how long he had been running, nor if he had been screaming the whole time, but his feet were cut in several places, and the first rays of sunshine were peeking out through the still, thick branches of the forest. In the distance, Robert could see the flame from his campfire still burning bright, and despite his terror at the knowledge of being stalked by something entirely inhuman, he had to get to his bike to stand any chance of escape. For a while, he hid behind trees, under bushes, his nerves absolutely shattered, refusing to go near the fire. His perceptions were broken, but Robert was a strong character, and after a time, a modicum of composure returned to him. Step by step, he neared his own camp. There was no sight of whatever had been sitting at that fire staring at him. By now, daylight illuminated the entire area, and after much self-bargaining, Robert decided to reclaim his belongings, grab his bike, and continue as quickly as he could on his way out of Queen Elizabeth Park. Everything seemed to be accounted for, and Robert even allowed himself a smirk at the thought of that creature at least not being a thief. That smile soon vanished at the sight of his bike. Unharmed, yes, but strands of some black, putrid liquid covered the seat and front wheel. This was not the time to be concerned with sludge on his bike. It was still working, and that was all that mattered. Had it been a week earlier, Robert would have been angry about the slightest scratch to his beloved mountain bike, but now he just cared about getting it home, or at least back to Aberfoyle Village, to civilization. After cleaning liquid off and packing up his tent, Robert once more continued onward as fast as he could. Robert reckoned, with a hard push, that he could be out of that horrid place in a day and a half, as long as he took minimal rests and cycled for the duration of available light. The weather was not exactly ideal, but while rain occasionally came, it quickly disappeared, leaving long stretches of the journey clear from the wearing effects of the elements. As the day progressed, so did Robert's unease. He felt oppressed on all sides, as if he was running from something terrible, yet nearing an undefined danger. A horrible realization bubbled up from his subconscious. What if that thing followed him all the way home? As this thought swirled around in his mind, he passed over the crest of a hill and down again, suddenly realizing what was wrong and why he was feeling so much unease about what lay ahead. A gulf in the land opened up before him. Pockets of stagnant water lay strewn between stretches of marshland and long grass, and in the center, there it lay, that horrible island of wretchedness. It was the woods where Robert had first seen his pursuer, and then, in a flash, it all made perfect sense. Call it superstition, Call it blind stupidity. Whatever you would call it, Robert knew they did not wish to see that twisted man again. As a child, he had been told ghost stories of people disturbing graves, and the ghosts of dead rising up to haunt the living. But he never took much stock in such things. Not until now, that is. What he did know was that he had inadvertently triggered the whole terrifying ordeal. He took something which did not belong to him. After hiding his bike in the long grass, Robert trudged towards that isolated pocket of woodland where what he now knew to be a grave lay, minus one oddly shaped black stone. He half expected for that thing to be sitting next to its resting place, but while there was a number of strange noises and movements between the trees, there was no sign of Robert's unwelcome guest. He assumed it was still out there looking for him. Finally, he found the grave, that elongated pattern of stacked rocks and stones. After locating the gap where he had torn the black stone from, Robert wedged it back in as hard as he could. A noise echoed from the other side of the woods, and Robert did not wish to hang around to find out what it was. Running as fast as he could over roots, mud, leaves, and fallen branches, he jumped out of the dark place into the open outdoors, filled with a sense of accomplishment and utter relief. It was not long before he was back on the dirt path, moving forward on his bike in search of one more place to sleep for the night, then home the next day. A weight had been lifted from Robert's shoulders. He knew he had unwittingly disturbed something unimaginable, unfathomable, but by returning that which he had taken, he had narrowly escaped what he assumed would have been a terrible fate, death, or perhaps worse. There was no explanation of this feeling of elation and survival. He just knew deep down that he had righted the wrong. That night, Robert lay in his tent. It was dark, as he had decided against a campfire, just to be on the safe side. He was confident that he would be left alone, however, and took great comfort in knowing that he was safe. While looking forward to the next day, and the comfort of home, that was a funny thought. A man who had always adored the countryside, detesting the humdrum of daily city life, looking forward to a couch, a television, a beer, and a warm bed. Next year, he would holiday at a sunny resort, lie on a beach for a couple of weeks, one preferably far removed from his homeland. Robert closed his eyes with a smile on his face. The noise which he had heard outside for so many nights suddenly screeched out a blood-curdling and overpowering volume. Without having to open his eyes, Robert knew the sound did not come from the woods. It came from inside the tent. Robert Francis was never seen or heard from again. Scotland is old. It has an ancient and hidden history of peoples and places long forgotten, but perhaps some trace remains, isolated and alone in the bitter wilderness. So should you ever wish to wander the hills, forests, or lochs of this old country, bear one thing in mind. If you find a collection of stones, heaped together not unlike a grave, and they are surrounded by trinkets of modern life, a sleeping bag, food cans, or perhaps even an old bike with the name Rob etched into it, walk on. Do not look back. Do not touch anything, whether it is unusual black stone or a simple piece of forest wood. Above all else, most certainly never take a souvenir, for those who lie in slumber nearby may just take one from you.